people who believe they've been abducted by aliens, or that they've seen a ghost, or that they've got psychic powers, whole range, anything in that kind of area. I'm interested in it, but I'm interested in it from the point of view of, can we explain those kinds of experiences? Basically, what you get a lot of the time, if you go off on a ghost hunt and you're in some reputedly haunted location and you're taking a few photographs, and then when you look at them, you will often see that there are what appear to be these kind of globes of energy. These things tend to come in waves, if you like. I mean, particularly of late, there's been a lot of talk about UFOs, or UAPs as they're now called. Uri Geller, for any listeners who don't know who he is, he appeared on the UK scene back in the 1970s. Now, at that point, I was still at school. I was a sixth former, and I was a complete believer in all this stuff. I was incredibly excited when Uri Geller appeared, because it appeared that here was somebody who could genuinely do psychic feats of various kinds. There is always the possibility that when people witness something unusual, like a crime, or a possible sighting of a ghost, or a UFO, or the Loch Ness Monster, that they will discuss it together before they're ever formally interviewed. And the point is that one person's account of what happened might contaminate another person's memory. So we wanted to look at this so-called memory conformity effect. I've been contacted by a few journalists recently, a couple of journalists, who've been asking me about a recent phenomenon whereby people are paying for spells on things like Etsy. You know, they're buying spells, and you kind of, they're saying, what's behind this? And it hadn't really struck me until you said that.
So Chris, from all of us here in India and Indian Genes, once again, welcome back to the show. There was a lot of feedback that I got last time that we had to bring you back for probably a deeper, longer discussion. And I hope this is going to be that, because the last time we spoke, we did touch on a lot of subjects, but let's probably go into a little bit more depth this time. And for people who are just listening to you, Chris, I'll let you introduce yourself to them and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Emeritus Professor Chris French. I retired from Goldsmiths, part of the University of London. I was in the psychology department there, where, amongst other things, I also ran the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit. That would immediately prompt the question of what the heck is anomalistic psychology? It's essentially the psychology of weird stuff. So I'm interested in the kind of weird experiences that people report, such as in non-paranormal terms. In other words, can we come up with psychological explanations for them? And wherever possible, can we test those psychological explanations? So that, in a nutshell, is what anomalistic psychology is. There was also a lesser strand of the research that we did, which was to directly test various paranormal claims. So on the one hand, we had the research which was asking the question, was basically saying, well, let's assume that paranormal forces don't exist. Can we explain these weird experiences? But secondly, we would sometimes directly test psychic claimants, for example, and see if they could really do what they thought they could do. And the bad news, I guess, is that no, they couldn't, but it was always interesting.
Right. And like you said, that you could probably break this down into two parts. One is the actual experience that a person has. And the second part, and we can get to the second part a little bit later, is paranormal activity that can be influenced by a person. And Uri Geller comes to mind right now with his spoon bending. But when you come back to the first part of it and you talk about experiences, so if I was to share my experience with you right now, a lot of it is going to depend on what I remember about it and how accurate that memory is going to be, because some time has passed and it could still be an event, but it is still being interpreted by me then it comes to you, you're going to interpret it. So none of us are actually in that experience,
I
even the
think
person
that
experiencing it.
that's a really, really important point, because almost always when someone is telling you about their what they take to be a paranormal experience, you are dealing with their report of that experience. You're not dealing with the event itself, because obviously it was something that happened in the past. Now, what that means is that we have to ask the central question of, well, how accurate is eyewitness testimony? And, we actually know from mountains and mountains of psychological research that eyewitness testimony can be notoriously unreliable. Even when people are being as honest and as accurate as they feel they can be, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually being accurate. In fact, the very first systematic investigation of the unreliability of eyewitness testimony took place in the context of a faked seance. This was back in the Victorian era in England. A chap called S.J. Davy had been to one or two seances, and initially he was very impressed by what he saw, and he took it all at face value. He thought it was genuine evidence that the spirits were interacting with the living. And then he got wind of the fact that all of these effects could be produced by trickery. And so he practiced the tricks himself. He put on his own seance. And what he did that was different, he got people after the seance to write down in as much detail and as accurately as they could what they had just experienced. And the important point was that those accounts which were given were often very, very distorted. People remembered things in the wrong order. They misremembered who was present when things had been happening, whether objects had been handled or not, and so on and so forth. And it really made the point very strongly that when it comes to memory for anomalous events and experiences, there can be an awful lot of memory distortion that's going on.
All right. And when you talk about, for these particular events, there could be distortion, then for any event there can be distortion, because not just paranormal. So are we then saying that there is no way in any circumstance or event that we can accurately say that a person is actually telling the truth in any circumstance?
Basically, memory is always a lot of people still kind of hold on to the naive belief that memory works like a video camera and it accurately records every detail of an event or an experience. And that, okay, later on you might not be able to remember all those details, but people believe that they are there somewhere if we can just get at them. And that's just not true. Memory is always a reconstructive process. When you report something that happened to you, you are basing your report on fragments of more or less accurate real memory traces that did correspond to the original event, but inevitably there are always going to be gaps as well. And we tend to fill in those gaps without realizing that we're doing it with what we think must have happened. And it's that kind of constructive nature of memory that can lead to errors. So a memory can be contaminated by something that someone says to you after the event has taken place. That can become incorporated into your own memory. And in fact, you mentioned Uri Geller. Uri Geller, for any listeners who don't know who he is, he appeared on the UK scene back in the 1970s. Now, at that point, I was still at school. I was a sixth former, and I was a complete believer in all this stuff. I was incredibly excited when Uri Geller appeared, because it appeared that he was somebody who could genuinely do psychic feats of various kinds. He could read minds, he claimed. He could divine the contents of sealed envelopes. He could do a whole host of other things. But the thing that really caught people's imagination was that he claimed he could bend metal just by gently stroking it. And I now, many years later, I have quite a few friends who are conjurers, professional magicians, and they can do this thing where it appears that they're just gently stroking a fork and it will suddenly apparently melt and go all soft. And they say it's a trick. It does not involve any paranormal powers. It involves a bit of sleight of hand. And, there are various different ways of achieving these effects, but it's a trick. Now, some people who'd seen Geller back in the day would push back on that and say, well, hang on, it can't just be sleight of hand because I've seen him do it. And after he had finished bending the spoon or the fork or the key or whatever it was, he'd put it down and it carried on bending when he wasn't even touching it. Now, you might think, well, that would rule out any possibility that it's just sleight of hand. A friend of mine, Richard Wiseman, who is himself a conjurer, a member of the Inner Magic Circle, he thought this was probably down to the power of suggestion. And so he did an experiment where he showed a video of an alleged psychic who was in fact a conjurer using sleight of hand, doing a spot of this supposedly psychokinetic metal bending. And the interesting part came after the key had been apparently bent. This was done using sleight of hand. The key was put down. There was a nice close-up shot. And in one condition, the audience heard him say, if you look closely, you'll see it's still bending. In the other condition, it was exactly the same, but they did not get that verbal suggestion. Of those who get the verbal suggestion, 40%, big number, 40% report they think the key carries on bending. It doesn't. In the other group, virtually nobody does. So that was really interesting. We were interested around a while later in a phenomenon known as memory conformity. And this refers to the fact that if you only have a single eyewitness to an event and they give you their reports, you probably won't give that as much evidential weight as if you've got multiple witnesses and they're all giving you very similar accounts. And that's probably quite sensible. Let's be clear about that. But there is always the possibility that when people witness something unusual, like a crime or a possible sighting of a ghost or a UFO or the Loch Ness Monster, that they will discuss it together before they're ever formally interviewed. And the point is that one person's account of what happened might contaminate another person's memory. So we wanted to look at this so-called memory conformity effect in an anomalistic context. So we borrowed the recording from Richard, and we had our participants watch the video in pairs. They're instructed to watch the video in pairs and then discuss it with each other and then report back to us independently what they had actually seen. Now, what the real participants didn't know was that the other person in the pair was actually a confederate, a stooge who was working with us and who had been instructed to either say during the discussion, yes, the key did carry on bending, or no, it didn't. And that had an additive effect. So if you were in the condition hour experiment where you got both the suggestion from the psychic and you then got the reinforcement from the stooge co-witness, we got up to levels of 60% of people reporting that the key carried on bending. It absolutely doesn't. And it just reinforces that point, which we already knew from other areas of psychology, to be fair, that it's not just what happens while you're witnessing an event that's important for memory, it's also what happens afterwards.
Right. And when you talk about memory conformity, does that also apply to cases where, for example, there is a system called cold calling, where if you know the techniques, then you can influence a particular person's mind, but that is probably only done one-on-one, or is there some part of that that is done in a group as well? Because I remember seeing this experiment recently where there were 9 people in a room and all 9 were obviously part of the experiment and the 10th person was not. But whether it's a color or whether it's a sound, every time those 9 people said something, the 10th one automatically by default just continued to say it. That's
a classic experiment which was part of the inspiration for the memory conformity studies. These original studies were kind of done back in the 1950s. And as you say, what they would typically do is have a group of people, and they were all given they'd be given a very simple task, like they'd be shown 3 lines, A, B, and C, and a 4th line, and the task was which of the lines A, B, and C is the same length as the 4th line. And if everybody in the group, up until the last person, said, it was A, when it was quite clearly not A, it was B. These were very, very simple tasks. That person would tend to go along with what the group had said. Now, in that situation, there was always debate about whether the person was going along with the rest of the group, but in their heads they were thinking, I don't think that's the right answer. Were they just kind of going along just to not rock the boat, but knowing that what they were saying was wrong? Or did they genuinely perceive the line as being a different length? And I think the evidence would suggest that in some cases, people managed to convince themselves that what they were saying was the right answer, but a lot of the time people didn't. In this kind of memory conformity situation, it's slightly different because the person who has had their memory distorted genuinely now believes what they're saying. So people would genuinely believe that, no, I'm sure that the key carried on bending, even though, as I say, it didn't. So it's a slightly different situation, but it was inspired by the same line of research that you're referring to.
Right. And taking that one step further, in that case, if a psychologist or a psychiatric wanted to use this in a positive way, where there is a person that's going through probably depression or anxiety, you can also induce positive memories or positive reinforcement. And then, I don't know if this happens, I'm just thinking about a positive way of using this, not whether it's right or wrong, but
Sure.
you can induce to make somebody feel better because then the person believes they feel better. So is this part of any technique that is being used?
Well, again, we'll probably make a distinction here between the body of research on eyewitness testimony, where typically you're dealing with a situation where a person has genuinely witnessed an event, but their memory of it may become distorted, on the one hand, and there's also a line of research on what are called false memories. And these are things that feel like real memories in your head, but they're memories, apparent memories for things that never actually happened at all. And although, the two areas obviously overlap, but they're often treated as kind of conceptually different to some extent. And we're now at a stage with false memory research that there are a number of techniques that have been developed which can pretty reliably implant false memories in a sizable minority of volunteer subjects. But they don't work on everybody, they won't work every time, but they work often enough that it's kind of got worrying implications for things like the legal system and so on, because obviously if you're talking about criminal cases, you need to have a good idea of whether these events ever actually really happened and so on. Now, people have also asked that same question, can we use any of these techniques to kind of change people's memories in a good way? And there's some kind of research that's been done on that. Elizabeth Loftus, who's the kind of queen of false memory research, she did some interesting work whereby people were, through various devious means, led to believe that on the basis of information they'd just provided by filling in questionnaires or whatever it was, it showed that when they were children, they really liked various healthy foods, which typically kids are not that keen on, things like broccoli and so on, and asparagus and what have you. And they really, or alternatively, that they really didn't very much like various foods that kids typically would like, so tasty but unhealthy stuff. And this actually then seemed to lead to changes in what people would choose to eat as adults following this manipulation. And so the possibility was raised there that maybe this could be used to basically get people to eat healthier. Whatever you may think of that research, it does raise obviously serious ethical issues, because you've got that whole thing about the dangers. At the moment, the research is not kind of that far advanced. The kind of thing you see in science fiction films where people end up with completely false memories for all kinds of stuff. But it could potentially move in that direction. And we need to think about those issues, because obviously if you have a situation where those in power could actually manipulate your memory to make you feel that various things had or had not happened, then that's got some serious implications. So we need to give that some serious thought.
Right. No, there are serious implications, and we'll probably leave that for another discussion. But to come back to Uri Geller, earlier you mentioned that he was bending spoons, so that was one part of it. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Was he not also involved in some sort of remote viewing exercises or techniques, or was that something that came up a little bit later?
Well, I think Geller has done that kind of thing, but one of the most systematic attempts to investigate remote viewing, which again, just in case any of your listeners are not familiar what it is, it's a technique that is used in various settings whereby people who claim to have psychic abilities claim that they can pick up information from remote locations, obviously without using the known sensory channels. And there are variations on how it might be done. Very often in an experiment on remote viewing, you might have the receiver, the person who is at base, who basically just goes into a relaxed state and says what thoughts are coming into their mind. And meanwhile, you might have a sender, or even more than one sender, who visits a remote location. It might be a park, a zoo, a library, a railway station, could be anywhere. And they try to telepathically transmit information back to the receiver who is back at base. Another way of doing it doesn't involve having a sender. It involves just giving the psychic, say, map coordinates and saying, tell us what's at this location. So some people claim that using this technique, they are able to pick up information from these locations. That body of research has been severely criticized on various grounds over the years. There are still some people who believe that it is a technique that produces genuine positive results. As you know, you're talking to me as a skeptic. I have to say I'm not convinced. It's a technique that could potentially have all kinds of implications, obviously, for kind of military intelligence, the Secret Service, and so on and so forth. And indeed, there was a program in America called the Stargate Project. They poured about $20 million into this research, which sounds like a hell of a lot of money, and indeed it would be for you or me. But in terms of the American weapons budget, it's not really very much at all. This was then assessed some years into the program to basically decide whether or not to carry on funding it. And they were quite clever because they got two reports, one from Professor Ray Hyman, who is a very well-known skeptical psychologist, and the other one from Jessica Utz, who is a statistician who is known to be very sympathetic towards parapsychology. And surprise, surprise, they came up with two different reports. Jessica Utz was kind of very, convinced that this showed it was a useful technique, that it did work. Ray Hyman did actually go so far as to say he accepted that there was some evidence of something happening here in this data, but he was not convinced that that was anything paranormal. He thought there'd be some kind of, at that point, unidentified problem with the methodology. And since then, we've moved on. That was kind of some years ago. And the debate goes on. There are still some people who believe in this technique and some who don't.
Right. And with remote viewing, you're talking about events that happen probably in space, and it's about location, a particular location. Now, if we try to connect that with events in time individually, and there has been some research recently that has been talking about neurons or active neurons, either in the gut or in the heart, that are equally connected to neurons firing in your brain. And what I'm trying to get to is intuition, because intuition is something that people have reported. Something has happened, they feel like something is going to happen, and of course it could be just a coincidence, but it's in time and it's there. How do you tackle intuition when somebody says that there are times in my life where I've seen this, I've got this feeling, and how do you convince somebody that it is a coincidence? Because every time it's happened and it's not materialized, no one talks about it, right?
Well, that's one thing, yeah. That as you say, if somebody has this kind of terrible kind of sense of foreboding, but then nothing happens, they're probably just going to forget all about it themselves, and they're certainly not going to go around telling people about it. Whereas if something bad does happen, they'll be convinced, oh, I knew something bad was going to happen, you know, and I've been proven correct. So that's one factor. I mean, another possibility is that perhaps, I mean, again, we're being speculative now, but perhaps people have picked up on some information to indicate that something bad might be about to happen, but without actually being consciously aware of it at the time. So, I mean, to give you a speculative example, supposing someone has to walk across a railway bridge every day to get to work, and one day, the first day in years, they decide not to go via that route. They walk past the bridge and take a longer route. And then later on in the day, or maybe even just after they've walked past it, the bridge collapses. Now, was that kind of precognition? Was that a premonition of some sort? Or maybe did they just pick up on the fact that there were kind of weird noises as they were going past the bridge? You know, the bridge was kind of being buffeted in the wind a little bit, and just something put them off. And we can't know. The only way that we can kind of test for these things is, well, in my opinion, the best evidence would come from properly controlled laboratory studies. But I mean, obviously, very often for real life disasters, like that kind of thing, that would be very difficult to do. I mean, there are some very intriguing cases anecdotally. I mean, a very famous case in the UK was the so-called Aberfan mining. Well, Aberfan is a village in Wales, and there was a big pile of coal slurry, right next to the village school, and it'd been very rainy, and the whole thing slid down, swallowed the school, killed lots of kids and teachers. It was a horrible, horrible disaster, and lots of people afterwards reported that they kind of had that sense that something was going to happen. In some cases, people had dreams about the school being smothered. And again, it does make you wonder in those cases. It's, as I say, we can't know with 100% certainty what the correct explanation is. But certainly after the Twin Towers collapsed, lots of people said they'd dreamt about it, or they'd had a feeling about it. Of course, as you mentioned, it could just be a coincidence. People tend to have very dramatic dreams, often about disasters, and sometimes that's going to happen just about the same time or just before an actual disaster does take place. So is it just a coincidence, or was it some kind of glimpse into the future? Can't really say with certainty. I mean, I'm a skeptic, so I tend to go for the coincidence type explanations.
Right. And considering the time that you've spent in this field, in this area, and the people you've spoken to, the research that you've done all over the world, has there been a change in the last few years that you have witnessed, whether it is the change could be in volume of cases reported or in intensity and interest? And volume, I would assume, is because there are many more people, we are more connected, and I mean, every village would have had a story someday, but nobody knew. But today, it's a global village, right? So everybody knows. So I assume there is volume. What about interesting cases? Do you see that there is any difference that has happened there, or it's the same if you compare both?
I mean, there've always been interesting cases, but as you say, once upon a time, if any record of them was kept at all, it might be just come to the attention of just a few people. Whereas these days, thanks to the internet, people, there's much easier to kind of gather together lots of these kinds of cases. And certainly there was a lot of reports that during the lockdown, the COVID lockdown, a lot of people were saying, I didn't ever see any kind of systematic research on this, but very much got the impression from people who were involved in paranormal research that there was an increase in reports of strange experiences. Now, that could have a number of possible explanations. I mean, obviously, one was just the general kind of increased stress that people were suffering. You know, people were generally kind of locked up at home. They might be lonely. People were losing their jobs, or they were worrying about their jobs. There was all kinds of stresses at that time. And there is pretty good evidence to suggest that people do tend to have more of these weird experiences when they are feeling very stressed. For one thing, it will disrupt sleep. So people might be more prone to episodes of things like sleep paralysis, for example. Because people are at home, they might notice various noises that they wouldn't normally notice because they're out most of the day, that kind of thing. So it's very hard to know what the actual cause was. It was probably more than one. There's probably multiple factors concerned. Whether or not beyond that there has been any increase in reports of paranormal. These things tend to come in waves, if you like. I mean, particularly of late, there's been a lot of talk about UFOs or UAPs, as they're now called, as if somehow there's been some kind of increase, and the authorities, particularly in America, the government and so on, are taking this all so much more seriously. And a lot of people kind of misrepresent what these government reports are saying, as to say that, they've now proven that UFOs exist, as if, this proves that aliens are flying around the sky. If you read it closely, that's not what they're saying at all. But because it gets a lot of media coverage, it's more part of the public consciousness. And so, and so people will often end up reporting. There are going to be more reports of people looking up and seeing something in the sky. They don't know what it is, so therefore they've seen a flying saucer, But overall, I'm not convinced. These things tend to fluctuate. They come in waves. There's a certain degree of some things are fashionable for a while and then they go out of fashion. But I'm not convinced that overall there is any major increase.
Right. I tend to agree with you. And you just mentioned, interestingly, somebody looks up in the sky and says, I've not seen anything. But that's a question I ask a lot of people on the other side as well, is when is the last time you looked up in the sky? So, but if you go back and think about it, if you look up in the sky continuously and daily, or you may be bound to see something. But people don't tend to look up at the sky anymore. So obviously you're not going to see anything. And so it's counterintuitive there. Now, to come back to these UAP incidents or UFOs, yes, you're right. People are talking about disclosure and it's all over the news. Something unique there probably is what we could start with is the specific dimensions or shapes of orbs that everybody is talking about. And that seems to be reported in different parts of the world, because when you talk about a flying saucer or a flying ship or a tic-tac, we get that because you need a lot of equipment for that, and you're following it probably. Yes, it could be so many things. But when somebody says they've seen an orb in their room, or somebody says there was an orb right outside my room, and everybody tends to describe the same way that the previous one did. You earlier spoke, I know, about false or induced memory, but do you see some connection to this there, or do you think that earlier it was fairies, probably a few 100 years ago, and before that it could have been elves or whatever? So is this the flavor now?
I think there's certainly some truth in the idea that different eras and different societies will obviously have their own take on these weird kind of reports, these weird experiences, and it will, as you're saying, conform to whatever the accepted ideas are within that particular society. So we can look back now to the early 1900s, and there were a hell of a lot of people who believed in fairies, including people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote whole books about it. And they were absolutely convinced that fairies really did exist, whereas now most people would totally reject that idea and see it as just being a silly belief. But the evidence that it was based on was very, very similar to the evidence that people now base their firm belief in UFOs on. I mean, when it comes to orbs, specifically, it's something which tends to, in my experience at least, be more associated with people looking at photographs that have been taken using digital cameras. And basically what you get a lot of the time, if you go off on a ghost hunt and you're in some reputedly haunted location and you're taking a few photographs, and then when you look at them, you will often see that there are what appear to be these kind of globes of energy. And I don't know where the idea came from. I've always kind of wanted to try and find the time to trace back who made this, first put forward this idea that these globes of energy, as they appear to be, are actually spirit energy that's not yet coalesced into a full form apparition. Now, although I don't know where the idea came from, I do know that the people who manufacture the cameras say, no, that's not right at all. What they actually are, what you've got there is a speck of dust or a drop of water that's just been caught out of focus in the flash of the camera. And that explanation makes a lot more sense to me. I mean, one of the reasons that I'd use that argument is it can be other things as well. It might be an insect. You might see an insect flying around, and on your video it looks like some kind of orb moving about. But whatever, it's not spirit energy. Typically with the orbs, the kind of classic orbs, you don't see them kind of emerging from behind objects. You always see what appears to be a full one. Now, if there really was something kind of out there in space moving around the room, sometimes part of it would be occluded by an object that was in front of it. You tend not to see that. So, as I say, in my experience, it's typically something that is associated more with photographs than with direct observation. I'm not saying it never happens with direct observation, but it more typically is associated with photographs and videos. I don't think it's very compelling evidence, basically, at all.
Right. I've been thinking about the orbs as well and trying to figure out where I have a simple explanation. You're going to tell me it's the wrong one, but I've thought we've all grown up with people looking into crystal balls, and for some reason the crystal ball told us a lot about the future. It was mystical. There was enigma there, and in all the films and movies that we saw, there was this person who was, if you could control that crystal ball, that emitted energy, sparks, and so somehow that was the closest I could come to empirically what was an object that resembled this the most and it had to be, I think, any of these objects have to come from popular culture, because it can't be mundane everyday stuff that somebody talks about, right? It's got to come from a film. It's got to come from something larger than life. It's got to be a fantasy story. And you spoke about fairies or elves or whatever. So that's the reason I thought about something else that was probably coming in from fantasy, but added to that is the technology that we're living in, right? We're living in a very technological world, and the orb is a geometrical shape. So rather than figures, your mind is looking at geometrical shapes subconsciously everywhere, even in a pixel on a screen. And so that's my half-baked theory on the orbs.
Not necessarily so half-baked. I mean, it could be a factor. I mean, one of the first psychologists to really try to understand the UFO phenomenon was Carl Gustav Jung. He wrote a book about UFOs. This was back in the day before people were allegedly being abducted by aliens. It was very much more about people just looking up in the sky and seeing flying saucers. And his interpretation is, I confess, it's not one that I would personally go along with very much, but he interpreted it as being some kind of symbolic representation of a mystical form, pretty much along the lines that you're talking about. One of the interesting things for me is that it was 1947 when the phrase flying saucer entered the English language. And this was because what happened was an individual called Kenneth Arnold had been flying his private plane near the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. And he said that he'd seen these amazing craft moving at amazing speeds, doing amazing maneuvers that were way beyond anything that we currently had, technologically speaking. And he reported this when he landed. And it was caused a big hoo-ha. It was reported all around the world. But when he was asked to describe the movement, he said the movement was like someone had thrown a saucer across water, so it's skipping, kind of the way that if you were skimming a stone across a lake, it might. And so when he used the word saucer, he was actually referring to the movement of the objects. And if you look at the original drawings he made of the shape of the objects, they look more like boomerangs. They weren't saucers at all. But the media, the press, loved that phrase, flying saucer. And so that's what people were reading about. And guess what? Subsequently, what people were reporting seeing were saucer-shaped objects. So it's an interesting example of the way that our expectations can influence our perception.
Right. And taking that further, these days it's from the saucer, it's moved to tic tac. So I think labeling and nomenclature becomes important, because if it catches your imagination, then people are now seeing tic tacs and a tic tac shape. So the shape has changed from a saucer. And I guess in the next few years, is going to be a tic tac shape or a capsule shape object. But this is very interesting. And for you as a skeptic, when you are listening to all of this, you're seeing all of this, is there something that you're waiting for where you then say, okay, this is interesting? And what would make it interesting for you? Because obviously, yes, we know that somebody just, like Neil deGrasse Tyson says, just pick up an ashtray from the alien spacecraft and bring it down. So that's obviously a fact. And anyone is going to convert there. But as a skeptic, because of what you're hearing, there could also be stuff that you're hearing that maybe makes you think. And I'm talking to that one level before proof. Is there something that you think will make you think that, okay, I moved more towards 50-50 or 40-60?
Well, I'd say actually, I mean, I guess, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I used to be a believer in a lot of this stuff. And it wasn't until kind of quite well into early adulthood that I discovered the joys of skepticism and really started looking at these things with a more skeptical eye. Until now I would definitely call myself a skeptic. But when I first got into skepticism, I would say that I was more skeptical. There were various attitudes and beliefs that I held then, which I would now see as being a bit too extreme, and I have come back towards the middle ground. So I think I'm quite often seen as being more of a moderate skeptic rather than an extreme skeptic. I'm certainly not someone who says, "Oh, we know that alien life isn't visiting the Earth on a regular basis," or "We know that telepathy doesn't exist," or "We know that there isn't life after death." I happen to believe all of those things, but it is very much on the kind of on a spectrum, as you implied. I would say that I'm kind of 90% feel 90% level of confidence, but there's that 10% that I could be wrong, and that was part of the motivation behind the various tests that we've done of psychic claimants over the years, just in case any of them turn out to really be able to do what they say they can do. I mean, if that were to happen, it would be an amazing scientific breakthrough, because the wider scientific community is generally very, very skeptical when it comes to paranormal. But it is possible that some of these claims might turn out to be true. As I say, I don't think they will, but I could be wrong.
And if you just look back at records, or you look back at what has actually happened, if you take the top 10 paranormal activities of the past, let's say, that have been explained, we've always had instances where we've gone from paranormal to normal, right, over a period of time. Generally, right?
Yeah.
So what was considered paranormal maybe 100 years ago, and then we've, through science, figured out something, and then it becomes normal. And as far back as you go, we've never had the reverse, where something that was started off as paranormal was proved. There has been no paranormal activity that is proved as of now, or is there something that's still? Yes, we have we just spoke about remote viewing, we spoke about intuition, we can talk about subconscious, which is more interesting because you spoke about Carl Jung and his subconscious or archetype. But is there something that is still out there, and as a skeptic, or the skeptic community would struggle with explaining?
I think that there are certain areas of parapsychological research which I'm trying to be as kind of fair as I can. I don't think that the skeptical community have definitively disproved. I mean, only probably a handful, but they are there. So, I mean, one example would be cases of apparent children who have apparent past life memories. Now, I think a lot of that can be explained in terms of false memories, and maybe it all can, but some of those cases are quite impressive. Another example would be the Ganzfeld studies of telepathy, where some parapsychologists claim that they do get positive results with those kind of studies. I would have my doubts for various reasons that we probably don't have the time to go into fully. Maybe we'll have another session where we'll talk about all that. And one or two other areas within parapsychology. Now, again, it very much depends who you ask. My cards are clearly on the table. I am a skeptic. But if you were to ask other people, there are some parapsychologists who would say, actually, they've proven that precognition is real beyond all reasonable doubt. And it's only kind of ignorance and prejudice on the part of the wider scientific community that means that this hasn't been accepted. I don't agree with that position, but they would argue that. And these are clearly, intelligent people who know all about statistics and experimental design and so on and so forth. So it does depend on who you ask. I used to start my Anomalistic Psychology course at Goldsmiths saying to the students, look, I could stand here and give you 20 hours worth of lectures that would convince you that the paranormal is real. Because I know the opposite side. I know the evidence on the other side well enough to be able to do that. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you why I don't believe the paranormal exists, but it's up to you to make your own mind up. And I'd say the same to you and to all of your listeners that, I have my views, my opinions, and I think they're based on good arguments, but you might not agree. You might look at the same body of data, the same body of evidence, and come to a completely different conclusion. That happens. That's the nature of controversial science areas.
Right. And do you see as we move forward with technology and the new discoveries, and we've kind of got control over nature to an extent, and I say to an extent, then are these paranormal activities or experiences in some way a pushback to what is happening all of a sudden and happening in speed? Whether it's true or not true is a different thing, but probably at an earlier stage where we were not moving at the speed that we are, everything was in equilibrium, and people, you could think what you want to think, and there was no overlap. Now there seems to be something that is pushing back at all the technology, for example, if we just start with technology. And do you see or think that could be some kind of a result of why we are all of a sudden seeing so many stories?
It could well be. I mean, we certainly seem to be living through a period where everything's changing so fast, and people do find that stressful and confusing and disorienting. And as I said before, there's quite good evidence that it's precisely at times where people feel that things are out of their control, that they are more likely to resort to various forms of magical thinking. And by that general term of magical thinking, I'm referring not just to paranormal beliefs, but I mean, I'm an atheist. Religious beliefs would come in there for me as well. Beliefs in unfounded conspiracy theories, traditional superstitious beliefs, beliefs in complementary and alternative medicine, etc., etc. And there's certainly a strong element of that, which is a kind of pushback against science. There's a kind of anti-science agenda in quite a lot of that. And yeah, there is that whole kind of thing of, the scientists don't know everything. Well, I mean, the thing is that if you really understand science, you know that the first person to say that scientists don't know everything is a scientist. There's a huge amount we don't know. I used to have a friend at university who was very fond of saying, the more we know we don't know. And you look at physics even, for example. I mean, obviously I'm not a physicist, but I do know that now we believe that the universe is kind of 90% dark matter and dark energy, and we don't even know what that is. So we've got so much more to learn, but we need to be aware of that, and we need to kind of a little bit more of a humble attitude on the part of some scientists, I think would be a good thing. A little bit more of an acknowledgement that, okay, we believe this on the basis of the evidence as it currently stands, but we may be wrong. That would be a useful thing to have. people often expect science to be all about certainty, and it just isn't. It's about trying to give the best explanation we can on the basis of the evidence that we've currently got. But new evidence might come along in the future.
Right. And I'm not sure if Richard Dawkins is listening to this, but if he is, then he is. But coming back to what you said earlier with trying to find answers to these phenomenons. Now, I can talk about myself and probably you. We grew up in the Star Wars generation, right? So UFOs and UAPs are easier to accept, and we can go with that. So even if there is disclosure, I don't see coming to the generation of probably my son or my children or my child is Harry Potter, and that's magic. So he or they today may accept magic and find that more interesting than UFOs or UAPs, because that. And again, I try to wonder whether does pop culture come first and followed by these phenomenons, or these phenomenons lead to that, or is it a cycle? Because it seems to be that. And I think I want to just check with the movie Matrix, for example, right? And it's amazing with the amount of interviews and books that I've read, and every academic talks about the movie Matrix and breaks it down as to where reality is. And probably 30 years ago, 40 years ago, academics were quoting books and philosophers and writers as to why their theories were right. But today you have academics and very prominent people quoting film and film scripts, but that was written by a particular person. So that is a change in itself as validation for a theory, right?
Well, yeah, I mean that film has. The most famous meme from that film is "Take the red pill," and obviously within the area of conspiracy beliefs, that's very much what the conspiracy believers think they are doing. They think that so much of what happens in day-to-day life is just a cover, and there's a lot of other stuff, typically very evil, bad stuff going on underneath that, and the deep state are in control, and so on and so forth. And they feel that they've got a more accurate perception, and that's very much come from that film. It's a great film. I love the original. The sequels weren't that great, but yes, these things definitely do have a big impact. It's interesting what you said about Harry Potter as well, because I've been contacted by a few journalists recently, a couple of journalists who've been asking me about a recent phenomenon whereby people are paying for spells on things like Etsy. They're buying spells, and you kind of, they're saying, what's behind this? And it hadn't really struck me until you said that as you said, whereas we kind of grew up in an age where we were watching kind of 2001: A Space Odyssey and Star Wars and so on, these days the kids have been brought up with Harry Potter, and so maybe their readiness to accept the idea that maybe some magical spells really do work, maybe that's got its roots there. That's an interesting thought.
So then, Chris, with people listening to this particular podcast and asking the question today, because we come back and end at the very beginning again, right? And that is, how do they deal with events in their life that, post listening to you and me on this conversation, do not make sense to them? And if it does not make sense to them, then it's important to them, right? How do they deal with that? And how do we encourage people to not hold back just because it seems untrue or it seems paranormal? Not reporting it or not speaking about it to somebody as well is equally bad, right? So we don't want people holding back emotion, which could lead to so many. And I'm just getting to the functionality and practicality of daily life for all of us.
I think it's kind of important to get across the message that unusual experiences are not that unusual. There's a recognition these days, certainly within clinical psychology in the UK, that it's a mistake. For example, if someone let's say someone had an episode of sleep paralysis and they experienced some really weird hallucinations, quite scary stuff. And they didn't know what to make of it. If someone like me were to come along and say, well, that sounds to me like it might be an episode of sleep paralysis you've had, and that what you perceived was a hallucination. Now, people get very defensive if you imply that maybe they were hallucinating, because in their minds that means that you're saying you think I'm crazy, and that's not true at all. Hallucinations can occur in the non-clinical population to a much higher degree than is generally realized, and without it being a sign of any kind of serious psychopathology. Now, it may be, obviously, if you are someone who is constantly hallucinating or you're hearing voices and you find it distressing, then yes, you may need some professional help from a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist or some other professional. But it's also the case, and this is increasingly recognized, that there are some people who have these kind of anomalous experiences on quite a regular day-to-day basis, but they're not worried about it. In fact, a lot of mediums, people who believe that they can talk to the spirits of the dead, appear to actually come into this category. They're people who are hearing voices. They really are hearing voices, but the voices that they're hearing, whereas they believe that they're coming from spirits of the dead, I would say no, they're coming from inside your own head, but it feels as though they're coming from outside. And just to kind of get people to a point where they don't feel the need to be so defensive. That's a big ask, because a lot of people would get a kind of reaction of an unpleasant reaction from telling their friends that they're hearing voices or they're seeing things that other people don't see. But if we can kind of try and get the message out more generally, that these things really are not that unusual, and they're not always something that you need to be desperately worried about, I think that would go a long way to taking the stress off those kind of experiences.
Right. And we do know that your time is limited, but before we let you go, it is the age of listicles, as you know. So the top 3 ways to do ABC, the top 7 hacks, the top 5. So let's try this. Let's try to get you to practically help us here. So the next time somebody wakes up in the morning and reads an article or a post that says there's a green orb that passed over their city last night and was driven by 4 horses on a chariot, and it was witnessed by 10,000 people, and it illuminated the sky. So what I'm trying to get to you is that, can you give us 3, 4, or 5 ways to how do you fact check yourself? How do you think correctly? What is this? How do you sequence your thought so that you accurately are able to then come to a conclusion? And is there a way you can tell us to do that?
Well, with something like that, the first thing would be that had that really happened, then there ought to be lots and lots and lots of video evidence to support it, because we all carry a good quality camera around in our pockets these days. And so just as a general point, it's always struck me as rather odd that even though that is the case, the evidence that we're presented with for UAPs or ghosts or anything else always tends to be kind of fairly poor quality. The only exceptions to that would be the ones that are kind of pretty obviously deliberate fakes that have been done using software like Photoshop or whatever. So that would be the very first question to ask. Always kind of question the sources of where this information is coming from. If this information is coming from a single blog on the internet, and none of the kind of more respected sources are kind of reporting it at all, then you can dismiss it. It's not true. So there are a number of kind of practical things that people can do to try to assess the source of the evidence. Actually check with things on fact-checking websites. Things like Snopes and so on are often really helpful here. You hear someone saying something, you think, that sounds a little bit dodgy, I'm not sure if it's true. Check it out on Snopes, and sometimes it'll turn out that, wow, it is true. more often than not, it'll be, no, that's not true. That was a hoax that was carried out in such and such a year, and so on. So there are things that you can do to try to basically improve your critical thinking skills, and to also be aware of the fact that we all suffer from various cognitive biases. We've talked a lot in the interview about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony and kind of memory in general, but there are a whole host of other cognitive biases that we all suffer from, and to therefore people have a kind of enormous faith in the evidence of their own senses and their own memory and so on and so forth. And one thing as a psychologist that I've learned is that quite a lot of the time that is misplaced. We can misremember, we can misperceive, we can misinterpret, and we all do it. We all do it. It's not just the believers that do it. The skeptics do it too. And our own beliefs and expectations will actually shape a lot of how we perceive and make sense of what's going on around us, and try to factor that in. You can't guard totally against these biases. They're there for everybody, and they always will be. But at least if you're aware of them, you can maybe try and take it into account.
Right. And before we let you go, why don't you tell us about your book? And I'm going to let you name the book, because that's a very unique name. So I'm going to, in fact, you could start with how did you come up with that name first? Because it stands out, and then we can probably let our listeners know where they can find it.
Okay. The book is called The Science of Weird Shit. And really the title started off as a joke. I was originally going to call the book Why Weird Stuff Matters, because I genuinely think it does. I think it gives us some great insights into human psychology. So that was going to be the title, but I just said to one or two friends jokingly, or I might just call it The Science of Weird Shit. And almost without exception, people said, "Oh, I'd buy that." So the seed was planted. I didn't know whether or not my publisher would kind of go for it, because it's a respectable publisher. It's MIT Press. But they did. They liked it. They were kind of very keen on it. And so now we've gone with it. One thing that I was a bit apprehensive about was the idea that maybe people would see the title and think that kind of the book was going to be kind of very dismissive and basically ridicule these kinds of beliefs and experiences. And that's not what it does at all. It just tries to understand them from a skeptical perspective. I think overall the advantage of having a kind of memorable title probably outweighed the fact that a few people might think, "Oh no, I don't like that. It's got a rude word in the title." So that's what we've gone with. And so that's available from hopefully all good bookshops, and even from websites such as Amazon, etc.
Great. And once again, thank you so much. I know that we missed out 2 weeks in a row, and I had to keep you holding today for 15 minutes as well, but you're very kind to come back, and I hope we can do this again, Chris, at some time in the future. And maybe I was just thinking of picking just one topic, because from the first time we spoke, from the first time we spoke to today, we've kind of drilled down, and we're getting to where we want to, but I think it's going to take us some more time to pick one unique subject. And maybe I'll try putting out a questionnaire to our listeners and asking them to come up with the topic that they think we should talk to you about, and we can take it from there.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, been good talking to you.
Great. Thank you once again, Chris, and hope to talk to you again.
My pleasure.